Greenland, winter 1930. At a temperature of 40 below zero, German polar researcher Alfred Wegener and his team are battling to accomplish their mission. Setting out in the name of science, they are experiencing a drama from which there seems to be no escape. I've come in search of traces of one of the most legendary polar expeditions of modern times. Here in Greenland, memories of it are still alive even 80 years later. This was an enterprise with great objectives, in an ice-cold land with its very own challenges. Alfred Wegener was already a well-known figure in his field. Years before, his bold theory on the origin of the continents had caused a furore.
That, gentlemen, will revolutionize polar research.
The Greenland mission was meant to be the pinnacle of Wegener's career. In spring 1930, Alfred Wegener set out from inside the Arctic Circle on his third and biggest Greenland expedition. The finest scientists had answered his call. They were impressed by his scientific brilliance and his experience of the Arctic. Wegener's aim was to spend a year gathering data from high up in the atmosphere and far down in the inland ice. Modern climate research was to be established with the first ever long-term study. A truly bold venture.
We need you down here.
The men set up base camp at the foot of a glacier. The tough climb up would be their first test. "120 tons of equipment had to be hauled up 1,000 meters before the onset of winter. Wegener documented everything. He was one of the first researchers to capture his expedition on film. I've found 80-year-old footage of the expedition in the Federal Archives. I've looked at the pictures time and again to get to know the man who was the driving force behind so much. Had it not been for Alfred Wegener, we would know far less about climate change. Footage from the early days of the expedition gives an impressive indication of the physical demands and almost inconceivable complexity of the enterprise. Nothing was staged. This is exactly what it was like. Yet, what we see here is only a foretaste of the horrific ordeal that awaited Wegener and his people. I want to know how it could all have happened. My search for clues begins at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven. The archives contain vast amounts of material. Manuscripts, notes, personal drawings, and Alfred Wegener's entire scientific works. Born in Berlin, 1880, strict Prussian upbringing. Best in class. University, married at the age of 33, 3 daughters. Military service in the First World War. Head of Hamburg Naval Observatory, professor in Graz, popular and respected everywhere. A sound life, which is what these photographs show. But there was also a totally different Alfred Wegener, an extremely daring figure. In 1906, he and his brother set up a record in balloon flight. Wearing only street clothes, they flew for 52 hours at a temperature of -16 degrees Celsius. Wegener, it seems, was always in search of borderline experiences. Shortly afterwards, he visited Greenland for the first time. Euphorically, he wrote to his brother, "Weaklings should stay at home and learn all the world's
theories off by heart. Out here, testing your acumen on the mysteries of nature gives an undreamt of substance to life."
It was in Greenland that the young scientist had discovered his passion for field research. On 2 Danish expeditions, he had successfully carried out meteorological measurements. Wegener realized that this inhospitable ice desert still offered immense research possibilities. But he had also learnt of the dangers it presents. In 1912, fierce storms almost cost him his life, but he remained undeterred. Wegener in 1930, on his own Greenland expedition some 20 years later. Bright, clear eyes, the alert gaze of an adventurer. And then, this photograph. I find the difference fascinating. It's almost as if he had slipped into another role, the respected university professor with the aura of a theoretician. And yet, Wegener was also an intellectual adventurer on the scientific scene. Many regarded him as the Copernicus of the geosciences. Students at Graz University in Austria revered their professor, who, it seemed, had an answer for everything. His theory on the origin of the continents was a scientific masterpiece.
Does the shape of the continents not show that they were once joined together? Look at their outlines.
Wegener's theory was simple, but brilliant. The continents, with their bizarre edges and shapes, only fit together so well because at one time they were one mass.
Which of you would like to fit our continents together to form a possible primal continent?
The concept wasn't new, but it was only Wegener who assembled all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to create a single supercontinent, Pangaea. Pangaea gave birth to the vast rock plates which, as the continents, float on the Earth's molten interior. Wegener showed that the Earth is in motion, and in doing so, completely undermined the prevailing school of thought.
Is this a reminder of a past when all the continents formed a single continent?
The only thing his theory of continental drift lacked was proof, and Wegener saw only one way of obtaining it. He asked the State Research Association to sponsor a large-scale expedition to the Arctic.
I am to spend a year collecting data for meteorology, glaciology and geology on the basis of a cross-section of Greenland. We will set up a western and an eastern station and an ice mitter station in the middle of the inland ice.
He was confident that state-of-the-art technology would ensure the swift establishment of his bases.
I plan to order the very latest propeller sledges from Finland and fit them with aircraft engines in Germany. That gentleman will revolutionize polar research.
Wegener knew that time was running out for him. As a family man, fast approaching 50, he would soon be too old to head such a huge enterprise. His first Greenland expedition as leader would, he hoped, crown his career. And at first, everything went smoothly. To his surprise, the research funds he had requested were provided in full.
Approved. 1 kilo of dried bananas, 4 kilos of sugar.
Equipment and provisions were ordered, and transport in Greenland organized.
2 kilos of macaroni, 1 pair of blue breeches, 2 pairs of boots, some woolen gloves.
Elsa, his wife, helped where she could, sending the expedition members a newsletter nearly every day. On April the 1st, 1930, their ship left Copenhagen. "The cord has been cut," Wegener noted in his journal. "The expedition is now underway." The ship's first stop was in Iceland, where 25 ponies were taken on board as pack animals. In Greenland, the cargo was transferred to an ice-going vessel, which then headed north to the bay at Umanak. This is Greenland, Alfred Wegener's place of yearning. The beauty of this vast natural landscape defies description. Greenland is the world's biggest island. Its enormous ice shield contains more water than the North Sea and the Baltic together. What happens here in the ice and in the atmosphere determines the entire global climate. This is a natural laboratory in real time. 80 years ago, this wild region was still one of the last undiscovered places on Earth. Wegener chose this place carefully. He thought the high coastal glaciers would be easier to scale from here. The location is so remote, I've had to be flown in by helicopter.
Thank you.
The adjacent mountain region is known today as Wegener Land. I've got the exact coordinates, so this must be the very place Wegener's expedition landed in spring 1930. When Wegener arrived, he was surprised to find the entire fjord still frozen. On May the 3rd, his ship reached the ice edge some way out and could go no further. The entire cargo was unloaded over the ice and taken to the only accessible place on land, 20 kilometers from where Wegener had planned to go ashore.
May the 4th. The problems have started. An attempt to break the ice and enter the bay failed. Oh dear, this is getting complicated.
The unfortunate situation cost Wegener 6 weeks, and the actual challenge had scarcely begun. The first task was to scale this glacier, an icy giant. This photo shows the base camp against the glacier. The ice has melted so much over 80 years that the place is almost unrecognizable. A total of 1,000 meters in height had to be negotiated over scree and ice with 2,500 crates. In all, 120 tons of material. And all the men had were a few dog sledges and their own physical strength. The Iceland ponies were carrying the most modern equipment of the day, the propeller sledges for traveling into the interior. It was a real struggle and a taste of the unknown hardships which lay ahead. Once the glacier had been conquered, the western station could be set up on an upland plateau, followed 400 kilometers away in the middle of the ice shield and at an altitude of nearly 3,000 meters by the Ice Mitter station, something no one had ever attempted before. Accompanied by Ola, a Greenlander, I want to retrace the first stage. Ola grew up here and knows the pitfalls of the glacier, which Wegener also had to negotiate. It means avoiding dangerous crevices and finding safe routes. One wrong step could prove fatal. Yet in this remorseless landscape, Wegener had to keep urging his men on to make up for lost time. For all those involved, it was both a physical and a mental tour de force. The sweeping vista provided only brief compensation for the immense effort. After all, Alfred Wegener was not here to admire the beauties of the landscape. His goal was far beyond, on the inland ice that covers the whole of Greenland with a frozen shield up to 2,000 meters thick. A magical place, but for the locals, one that is also ghostly.
There was many bad spirits on here. We call them demons.
Ola told me that his forebears never set foot in this place. For them, it was the home of ghosts and demons. But Wegener had to press on regardless, and the Greenlanders followed the stranger because if the expedition was to be a success, the German scientist had to head into the interior. Finally, on July the 15th, the first dog sledges were ready to take meteorologist Johannes Georgi, Wegener's right hand, into the unknown.
Georgi, all the best.
Ahead of Georgi lay 400 kilometers and a difficult task. A kilometer counter measured the distance covered. Every 500 meters, flags marked the route. After 16 days, the team reached its destination. Land where no human being had ever set foot. Georgi stayed behind alone to set up the ice meter station. From now on, collecting data on the upper air, the temperature and the air pressure would determine his everyday life in this no man's land. The simple tent provided hardly any protection from the freezing temperatures. Consequently, the next column would bring the winter house and urgently needed supplies. That, at least, is what Wegener had promised Georgi. Back at base camp 400 kilometers away, the men were working feverishly on the next transports. First and foremost, Ernst Sorge, who would reinforce the ice meter station as a glaciologist, and his colleague Fritz Löwe, another weather expert. Time was running short. A vast amount of material, fuel, provisions and vital equipment still had to reach the station before the onset of winter. Otherwise, not only the mission itself would be threatened.
August the 6th. I'm nearly at my wit's end. I'm afraid, really afraid, that we won't make it. We're now totally dependent on the propeller sledges if we're to prevent the central Fern station from being a total failure as a winter station.
The propeller sledges were the trump in Wegener's plan. They would, he hoped, revolutionize polar research. But things turned out differently. I've come to the museum in Umanak to take a look at the legendary speedsters which Wegener had built especially for the expedition. For the time, they were like vehicles from a science fiction novel. Wegener affectionately named the sledges Snow Bunting and Polar Bear. They were designed to transport tons of material. But as Peter Kruse told me, the sledges had never been tested under Arctic conditions. And weeks passed before Wegener had transported them onto the inland ice, assembled them and got them running. The sledges were designed by the very best engineers. Together, the axles, the steering and the propeller suspension constituted a technical masterpiece. But the sledges were still not good enough to prevail in the extreme conditions on Greenland. Consequently, Wegener was entirely dependent on help from the local population. Wegener rented 150 huskies. I set out in search of the unnamed heroes of the expedition. The grandfathers of these men carried heavy loads for Wegener and, together with their dogs, supported him as sledge drivers. At first, they worked for just food and pay, but with time, true friendships developed. I learned that through his honesty and respectful treatment of them, Wegener won the Greenlanders' trust. Konunguat remembers the tales told by his grandfather, who was very much afraid of the spirits on the inland ice. As part of Wegener's expedition, he ventured into the feared taboo zone. When he returned to the village with his dogs, he was given a hero's welcome. A magical way of traveling. That is how Wegener described it time and again. The Greenlanders trusted him so much that they even let him into the secrets of driving a team of huskies. The most important thing is to keep each dog in its position. Otherwise, the lines get tangled up. And when the column stops, you must make doubly sure the dogs don't eat their own harnesses or start fighting. Yet everything always looks so easy. This is what the location of Ijsmitte station looked like. Not a single person far and wide. No radio contact with the others, no chance of getting out, apart from on foot. After only a few minutes, I feel like an outcast. How must Wegener's people have felt after weeks and months? And the tents weren't exactly warm and cozy. A single layer of thin cotton as protection from the blizzards and temperatures of up to 40 below. It was in a tent like this that Georgi and Zorga stuck it out at Central Station. I try to imagine what it must have been like. Without the special expedition clothing I'm wearing, and instead with woolen pullovers and fur-lined sleeping bags. By the time Ernst Zorga joined Georgi at Ijsmitte, the tents no longer offered protection. Icy winds were causing the temperature to drop dramatically. The two men had no time to wait for the arrival of the winter equipment. In order to survive, they dug themselves deep down into the ice. The two men documented their work on film. Meter by meter, the chambers Georgi had already excavated for storing his instruments were extended to create an inhabitable ice bunker. The cold here is unbelievable. Yet the men even carried out their scientific experiments. Their total commitment to the expedition undoubtedly increased the moral burden on Wegener's shoulders. In the meantime, the western station on the coast had been completed. But what if Wegener was unable to supply the researchers at Ijsmitte in time? The expedition was not blessed with good fortune. Heavy new snow meant the propeller sledges couldn't be used. Wegener could not play his trump card.
September the 6th. Disaster has struck. The failure of the powered sledges has created an intolerable situation. This is the most serious crisis the expedition has had to deal with. It seems doubtful whether we will be able to handle it. Heavens, what kind of an unexpected mess have we got ourselves into?
The responsibility weighed heavily on Wegener. He saw only one solution: a final sledge trip to save his men at the Eismitte station. And Wegener would lead it himself, in a race against time. That was on September the 6th. By the time Wegener had assembled the column and organized everything, a further 2 long weeks had passed. What's more, that year, the winter in the Arctic came earlier than expected. Wegener was under extreme time pressure. On September the 21st, Alfred Wegener set out for the Eismitte station, accompanied by researcher Fritz Löwe and 13 Greenlanders. They had loaded up a good 4,000 kilograms of supplies to provide Georgi and Zorge with all the essentials. In the weeks that followed, the reports became more and more dramatic. On the basis of notes that have been preserved, I'll attempt to reconstruct the course of events. At the same time as Wegener left the western station, the supply column with which Ernst Zorge had travelled to Eismitte was on its way back. 3 kilometers from the coast, the returning team met Wegener's group. They handed the leader of the expedition a letter from Georgi and Zorge. The letter contained an announcement which shocked Wegener.
Unless supplies arrive within 4 weeks, Georgi and Zorge will head back.
400 kilometers on foot through the merciless cold. Wegener knew it would mean certain death for the men and the end of his expedition. Now, he had to risk everything. The weather got worse from day to day. The dogs were almost unable to pull the sledges in the deep new snow. After only 62 kilometers, the first Greenlanders decided to turn back. They had always feared the inland ice. Now, Wegener could only take half the vital supplies with him. The rest remained along the way as a depot. Wegener gave the returning team a message for the western station.
The whole thing is a disaster. Now it's about survival.
We'll do what we can,
And there's no need for us to give up hope.
Where in a situation like that did Wegener get his optimism from? He was only here, 62 kilometers out. Shortly afterwards, he noted the paltry daily stages: 15 kilometers, 0 kilometers, 6 kilometers. Far too little considering their provisions. I think I would have despaired. And then, even the remaining Greenlanders also turned back, apart from one. Like Wegener and Löwe, Rasmus Willemsen was resolved to give his utmost. With a load on just 3 sledges, they continued. 250 kilometers lay ahead, and it will have been clear to them that now they were going to need all the luck in the world. Just one Greenlander had stayed with them, Rasmus Wilhelmsen, and from then on, his sledge was always out in front. Barely 21 years old, he became the leader of the little rescue team, which at temperatures of up to 50 below was itself battling to survive. The distances covered each day were getting shorter and shorter. Fritz Löwe could no longer feel his toes. Wegener knew that nothing could be done about it. Löwe's toes were frostbitten. They had already been traveling for 35 days. Turning back had never been an issue. But now their reserves of strength and supplies were almost exhausted. On October the 30th, after 6 murderous weeks, they finally reached Ice Mitte. In the meantime, Georgi and Zorge had decided to spend the winter at the station in order to safeguard their scientific data, the reason for all their exertions. Wegener, Löwe and Wilhelmsen had arrived without supplies, exhausted, but grateful to have survived. At that moment, no one thought about the sense or madness of their dangerous journey. On the eve of his 50th birthday, the most wonderful gift for Wegener was to hear that the scientific work would continue. He had achieved his goal.
Large temperature fluctuations over just 10 days. The fluctuations are dependent on the wind speed.
Wegener had decided that after just a day's rest, he and Rasmus Wilhelmsen would set off on the long journey back.
All the best.
Alles gut.
Thank you.
He suspected what lay ahead. But with food in short supply, there was no way they could all have spent the winter in the bunker. Only Fritz Löwe had to stay behind at Ice Mitte because of his frostbitten toes. On November the 1st, the friends said their goodbyes. The overwintering team reported later that Wegener had seemed strangely carefree and happy. Wegener was aware of the huge scientific value, the knowledge advantage his work in Greenland would constitute. We can't say whether this was reflected in the great personal efforts he made. What we do know is how far research advanced as a result of his achievement. Back then, new balloon and kite systems were used for exploring the upper air layers for long-term climate studies. The thickness of the Greenland ice shield was also determined for the first time by means of seismic waves triggered off by specific detonations in the ice. The result? A staggering 2.7 kilometers. November 1930. With a minimum of provisions, Alfred Wegener and his loyal Greenland friend were on their way back to the western station. But soon, their exhausted dogs would have no strength left. At the same time, at the Ice Mitte station, a life or death situation had arisen. Löwe's toes were frostbitten, and deadly gangrene had set in. Only an emergency amputation could save his life. Surgery with a pocket knife and various pliers. No anesthetic, no disinfectant. And Georgi wasn't even a doctor. It doesn't bear thinking about. and yet Löwe survived the ordeal in the ice bunker. It's incredible what strength a human being can mobilize in extreme situations. I've been deeply moved by other reports from the ice mitter. They tell not only of the deprivations, the cold, the depressing darkness of the polar night. Above all, they also document the iron will of this team, which was determined to survive at all costs. In their ice bunker, at a temperature of -10 degrees, the men mastered the days and nights in the darkness, each in his own way. They became survival experts at the end of the world. Throughout the long, hard winter, they wondered how Wegener and Willemsen had fared. Spring 1931. In good weather and on smooth, firm snow, the propeller sledges functioned as planned. The men from Western Station headed for ice mitter at top speed, but with dark premonitions, because they too had had no news all winter long. Georgi, Zorge and Löwe had longed for this moment for months. They were the first human beings to have survived the winter on the inland ice. Yet their joy quickly gave way to shock. Where, they asked, is Wegener? But their rescuers from the Western Station couldn't say, because Alfred Wegener had never arrived there. Later, a search party reconstructed the chain of events. After only about a third of the way back, Willemsen and Wegener had had to abandon one of their sledges. Wegener then continued for another 50 kilometers on skis until his strength failed. Halfway to the Western Station, Wegener's grave was found. Willemsen had marked it with skis. The corpse was intact. It showed no sign of frostbite. Wegener probably died of heart failure, caused by tremendous physical exertion. Of all people, Alfred Wegener, who had more polar experience than anyone else, failed to return from the eternal ice. It was a tragic end to his life, but was it really inevitable? Or did Wegener himself perhaps take the wrong decisions? It was the subject of much discussion. In the end, some people even made Georgi responsible for Wegener's death. It was only because of his letter from Ice Mitte, they claimed, that Wegener had embarked on his forced march. But Georgi's letter was not the cause. Wegener would never have abandoned his men, and without the scientific data gathered at Ice Mitte, there would have been no point in the expedition. Wegener had risked everything for its success. Giving up was never an option for him. Rasmus Willemsen was never found. He remains lost in the inland ice, along with Wegener's last notes. After returning home, Wegener's comrades experienced fluctuating fortunes. Under the Nazis, Fritz Löwe, who was Jewish, lost his job. He emigrated to Britain, and from there, in 1939, to Australia, where he set up the country's first meteorological institute. Johannes Georgi never got over having been accused of causing Wegener's death. Ernst Sorge returned to the Arctic several times, but the war soon put an end to his travels. As a soldier, Sorge was taken prisoner by the British. He died only a year after being released.
We'll do what we can, and there's no need for us to give up hope.
By the time Elsa Wegener read the last letters from her husband, he was long dead. She did everything possible to preserve his legacy. Along with reports from the expedition participants, she published his notes. Alfred Wegener's last work appeared a year after his death. It inspires polar researchers even today. Alfred Wegener was left in the eternal ice he had loved so much. With his unflinching research zeal, he left behind knowledge akin to a hidden treasure. Even today, climatologists are drawing newer and newer findings from his work. Inspired by his visions, he became a pioneer who went to the very limits and even beyond.